than it has ever been before right now. And more people are dying than ever before, literally day after day. Now, we all hope and pray that the new vaccine will be distributed as quickly as possible and that it will put an end to this nightmare. But today, the truth is that millions of low-income and middle-class families are suffering in a way that they have not suffered since the Great Depression of the 30s. Today, the reality is that over half of our workers are living paycheck to paycheck, trying to survive on a starvation wage of 10 or 12 bucks an hour. The reality is that millions of our senior citizens are trapped in their homes, unable to see their kids or their grandchildren, unable to go to a grocery store, and many of them are trying to get by on $12,000, $14,000 a year Social Security and scared that they may come down with the virus and die. In addition, millions more with disabilities are suffering. Further, in our country today, 1 out of 4 workers are either unemployed or make less than $20,000 a year. And in the midst of this pandemic, because we are the only major country on earth not to guarantee health care to all people as a right, in the midst of this pandemic, worst health care crisis in 100 years, over 90 million Americans are uninsured or underinsured and unable to go to a doctor when they need to. Further, we have the worst eviction crisis in modern history. Some 30 million families worried that because they cannot pay their rent, they may end up out on the street. That is, Mr. President, where we are today economically. And if this country means anything, if democracy means anything, if the U.S. government means anything, it means that we cannot turn our backs on this suffering. Not in Vermont, not in Wisconsin, not in New York, not in any state in this country where people are hurting in an unprecedented way. It means that we cannot leave Washington as senators for the holidays to go back to our families unless we address the pain and anxiety of other families throughout this country.
Would my colleague from Vermont yield for some support for his amendment?
I would be happy to yield to the
I'll speak briefly, and I thank my colleague. I want to join my friend Senator Sanders to support his amendment to give $1,200 in direct financial support to the American people in the year-end emergency relief bill. Now, this effort should not subtract from any other program already in the bill, like enhanced unemployment aid to small business, education, health care, or another provision. We don't need to offset the cost or cut from elsewhere in the bill to make sure the stimulus checks are $1,200 for each adult and then money for children and others, as he will elaborate. Much of the money will go back into the economy anyway. The reason for the amendment is simple. Over the course of this pandemic, working Americans have taken it on the chin. Millions have lost their jobs through no fault of their own. 26 million have had trouble putting food on the table in the last 5 weeks. Bread lines stretching down American highways. 12 million Americans owe an average of $6,000 in rent and mortgage. So we have an opportunity in this emergency relief bill to give financial aid directly to those Americans. It could mean the difference between Americans paying the rent or not, affording groceries or not, the difference between hanging on until the vaccine helps our country get back to normal. Now, the only objection we've heard is this will add too much to the deficit. That's why a Republican senator rejected a similar request earlier today to push a baseless agenda of austerity. Please. By now, Republican objections over debt and deficit are comical. They added $2 trillion to the debt for a massive tax cut for corporations and the wealthy, and that was during a steady economy. But now the economy's on life support. Americans are queuing up on bread lines, filing for unemployment just as a Democratic president is about to take office. All of a sudden, the deficit scolds are back. It's ludicrous. It's ludicrous. Chairman Powell, hardly a big liberal, of the Federal Reserve insisted the risk of overdoing it is less than the risk of underdoing it. The quickest way to get money into the pockets of the American people is to send some of their tax dollars right back where they came from. So let's step up to the plate, deliver the $1,200 survival checks to millions of Americans before the holidays. I support Senator Sanders' request fully and hope the Senate will consent and yield back.
Well, let me thank the senior senator from New York, the Democratic leader, for his strong statement. He is exactly right. In this time of crisis, it is comical that suddenly our Republican friends once again discover that we have a deficit. This is a moment of emergency, and we have got to respond to the needs of working families, and I thank Senator Schumer for his strong support for this legislation. Mr. President, members of Congress should also be aware that we are far behind other major countries in terms of protecting working families during this pandemic. Not only does every other wealthy country guarantee health care to all people as a human right, almost all of them are providing far more generous benefits to the unemployed and the struggling in their countries than we are doing in our country. Mr. President, Madam President, several months ago, I introduced legislation along with Senator Kamala Harris, now our Vice President-elect, and Senator Markey, that would, during the course of this economic crisis, provide $2,000 a month to every working-class person in this country. And frankly, that is exactly what we should be doing. But unfortunately, given the conservative nature of the Senate, I understand that is not going to happen. Yet, at a time of massive income and wealth inequality, as Senator Schumer just indicated, at a time when huge corporations were making record-breaking profits, the Republican leadership here in the Senate was able to provide over $1 trillion in tax breaks to the 1% and large corporations. Yes, at a time when climate change, yes, climate change is real, at a time when climate change threatens the entire planet, this Congress was able to provide hundreds of billions of dollars in corporate welfare to the oil companies and the gas companies and the coal companies who are exacerbating the climate crisis. Yes, just the other day, here in the Senate and in the House, legislation was passed which would provide $740 billion to the military, the largest military budget in history, more than the next 10 nations combined. We spend more on the military than the next 10 nations combined. So we could do all of those things. Tax breaks for billionaires, massive corporate welfare, huge military expenditures. But in the midst of the worst economic meltdown since the Great Depression, somehow Congress is unable to respond effectively to the needs of working families. Madam President, as you may know, I have recently introduced legislation to provide every working-class American an emergency payment of at least $1,200, which is $2,400 for a couple and $500 for each of their children. This is not a radical idea. This is an idea that is supported by President Donald Trump. It is an idea that is supported by President-elect Joe Biden. It is an idea, by the way, that according to a recent poll is supported by 75% of all Americans, including 77% of Democrats and 72% of Republicans. Further importantly, this amount of direct payment is exactly what Congress passed unanimously 9 months ago as part of the $2.2 trillion CARES Act. Let me repeat. In March, every member of the House and Senate, appropriately, including myself, voted to provide a direct payment of $1,200 for working-class adults, $2,400 for couples, and $500 for their kids. Madam President, that was the right thing to do 9 months ago. And given the fact that the crisis today is in many respects worse than it was 9 months ago, that is exactly what we should be doing right now. Madam President, as a result of the pandemic, the government told restaurants and bars, retail stores, movie theaters, schools, malls, small businesses all over this country, shut your doors. It is too dangerous for you to be open now. And they did that because that is what the public health experts said was the right thing to do in order to control this horrific pandemic. But what the government has not done, Madam President, is to provide the workers who lost their jobs and lost their incomes as a result of those shutdowns with the help that they need in order to pay their bills and to survive economically. The $600 a week in supplemental unemployment benefits that Congress passed unanimously in March expired in July, over 5 months ago. And during that time, the Republican Senate has done nothing to help working families pay their rent, feed their children, go to a doctor, or pay for the life-saving prescription drugs they need. And the Senate has not done anywhere near enough to provide help for the struggling small businesses in Vermont and all across this country who are desperately trying to stay afloat. Further, Madam President, as bad as the economy has been in general, it has been far worse for African Americans and Latinos. During the pandemic, nearly 60% of Latino families and 55% of African American families have either experienced a job loss or a cut in pay. Madam President, for 9 months, we have asked tens of millions of working people in this country to survive on one $1,200 check, with no help for health care, no support for hazard pay, no assistance for rent relief. Absolutely nothing. Meanwhile, Madam President, I should mention that over this same 9-month period, 651 billionaires in the United States became over $1 trillion richer. $1 trillion in increased wealth for the very richest people in our country. One $1,200 check for tens of millions of Americans desperately trying to survive. That is unconscionable, that is immoral, and that has got to change. Now, Madam President, let us recall that way back in May, the House of Representatives passed the $3.4 trillion HEROES Act, which, among other things, included $600 a week in supplemental unemployment benefits and another direct payment of $1,200 for working-class adults, $500 for their kids, and generous support for small businesses, hospitals, education facilities, and state and local government. In other words, the House passed a $3.4 trillion bill that was, in fact, a very serious effort to address the enormous crises facing our country. I should also add that in July, several months later, the House passed another version of the bill, so-called HEROES 2, and this legislation was for $2.2 trillion. That same month, in July, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell proposed a $1.1 trillion bill that also provided $1,200 direct payment for working-class adults and $500 for their kids. And then in October, Secretary Mnuchin, in negotiations with Speaker Pelosi, proposed a COVID relief plan for $1.8 trillion. That's Mnuchin representing the Trump administration. So in the last number of months, we have had major proposals of $3.4 trillion, $2.2 trillion, $1.8 trillion, and from Majority Leader McConnell, $1.1 trillion. And yet today, right now, after months of negotiating by the so-called Gang of Eight, we are now down to just $908 billion in legislation, and that includes $560 billion in offsets in unused money from the CARES Act. So what we are talking about now is going from an original House bill passed in May calling for $3.4 trillion in new money down to today $348 billion in new money, roughly 10% of what Democrats thought was originally needed. Madam President, in my view, the $348 billion in new money that is included in the proposal now being discussed is totally inadequate given the nature of the unprecedented crises that we face. The American people cannot wait any longer. They need economic relief. Right now, their kids are going hungry. They are being evicted from their homes. They can't go to the doctor. They need help, and they need it now. Every working-class American needs $1,200 at least, $2,400 for couples, and $500 for children. And let me be clear to emphasize a point that Senator Schumer made, and that is what I am talking about now is money that must not be taken from other important priorities like 16 weeks of supplemental unemployment benefits, aid for small business, nutrition, housing, education, and the other important provisions in this bill. We need adequate funding to address the unprecedented crises that we face. We should not and cannot and must not take from Peter to pay Paul. We cannot cut on unemployment benefits in order to help small business. We have got to do it all right now. So, Madam President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of S. 5063, which I introduced earlier today, that would provide a $1,200 direct payment to every working-class adult, $2,400 for couples, and $500 for their children, that the bill be considered read 3 times and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Madam President,
Senator from Wisconsin.
reserving the right to object. The senator from Vermont made a couple statements. I'd just like to repeat the words that we're in a crisis. This is an emergency. We can't turn our back on this suffering. I agree. I've agreed for months. But he also said something that was completely incorrect. You might call it a lie. He said Republicans have done nothing. That's not true. I was on daily calls during the August recess after we had attempted and were debating internally a $1 trillion package in tail end of July before the August recess. Recognizing, and I was one of the ones pointing out the fact that we'd already passed, as a good senator from Vermont said, over $3 trillion in 4 different COVID relief financial packages early in the pandemic. There was at that point in time, there was $1.2 trillion of that unspent. A big chunk of that wasn't even obligated. Today, as we stand here debating this now, we still have a little under $600 billion unspent and unobligated. So the point I was making to my Republican colleagues during that late the last few weeks in July, in those conference calls in August, is before we authorize any more money, before we further mortgage our children's future, why don't we first repurpose and redirect what we already passed? Because what we passed very quickly. Because we had to. We had to do something massively, and we did something massively so that markets wouldn't seize, so that the people, the individuals that were out of work through no fault of their own, the businesses that were shut down through no fault of their own, could get financial relief. And so we came together unanimously, we did that. But doing it fast, doing it massively, I certainly knew it was going to be far from perfect. Well, we found out the federal government actually has a hard time spending $3 trillion because over the course of a number of months, they didn't spend it all. They couldn't even obligate it. So what Republicans did during the August recess, because we couldn't come to an agreement by the end of July, we worked long and hard on a targeted bill. More than $600 billion, $300 plus up for people on unemployment, $260 billion for small businesses, $100 billion for education, tens of billions of dollars for vaccines and testing and agriculture and child care. And we offered that on the floor. 52 Republicans voted to proceed to that bill. Democrats just said no. I felt it was a crisis, an emergency, and we shouldn't have been turning our backs on these people that are suffering in September. Democrats said no. All they had to do was say yes. They couldn't take yes for an answer. And Madam President, I often use the analogy is if I go up to you, because I know you're a generous person, say, Madam President, give me $200. Kind of look at me a little shock. I say, well, I won't give you 200, but I'll give you 100. And then I go stomping off and say, no, it's 200 or nothing. That's what the Democrats did to over $600 billion in needed and necessary relief for the crisis, for the emergency, for the people we don't want to turn our backs off toward because they're suffering. If they're really serious, if they actually wanted a result, if they wanted to relieve the suffering, wouldn't the logical thing have been to say yes, take $600 billion, pocket it, get that relief flowing in September, then come back and argue for more? But they said no. They were cynical. They played politics with it. And that's what they're doing here today. You know, I'm sure, to paraphrase a widely known saying, that the road to total national bankruptcy is paved with good intentions. I'm sure that's true. I don't question the good intentions of any member of this body. We all want to provide the relief. We all want to relieve suffering. We all want to help fellow Americans that are hurting through no fault of their own. But we talk about suffering, we use words, we don't look at numbers very often. Good Senator from Vermont has spouted a few numbers. Let me quote a couple. Let me just kind of lay it out. I didn't have enough time to do a chart, so I'll try and go through this slowly, but I think it's important to put this all in perspective. Prior to the COVID recession, we had the record number of Americans employed at the end of December 2019. Just under 159 million Americans were employed. By April, 2 months into the pandemic, 3 months into the pandemic, employment had dropped to 133 million. That's a loss of over 25 million jobs. 25 million, which is why we acted in a bipartisan fashion to provide relief for those people, 25 million who'd lost their jobs. Now, the good news, it's hard to keep the American economy down when you don't overtax, when you don't overregulate. So in November, the latest figures we have, there are now 150, just shy of 150 million Americans employed again. Now, I realize some are underemployed, but still, you have 150 million Americans employed, down to about 9 million jobs from that record high when unemployment was only 3.5%. We had a record economy because we stopped overregulating and we had a competitive tax system. Now, unemployment rate is 6.7%. In the CARES Act, which I supported because I want to help people, part of that was the economic impact payments, basically what the senator from Vermont is proposing here in this bill he wants to pass by unanimous consent. It spent $274 billion. It was paid to just under 166 Americans for an average check of about $1,673 per person. If you break that down into households, because according to the Federal Reserve Bank in New York, the average check per household is $2,400, that's 115 million households that got a check. 115 million. Now remember, at the low point, 25 million Americans had lost their job. We sent checks to 115 million households. 4.5 times the number of people that lost their jobs. My problem with the CARES Act, with the first four packages, is it was a shotgun approach. We just spent money. We just opened up the spigot and we just sent it all over the place. We didn't have time to target it to those that really needed it. As a result, and we're seeing today, businesses that needed it, business owners, small business owners, have been wiped out of their life savings. They didn't get relief. It wasn't well designed. It wasn't well targeted. And we probably spent hundreds of billions of dollars and sent it to people that didn't need it. Madam President, we're $27.4 trillion in debt today. That's 128% of the size of last year's economy. If this bipartisan deal goes through, about $1 trillion, we'll be in $28.4 trillion in debt, 132% of GDP. I remember the good old days when I first got here. I ran because we were mortgaging our kids' future. We were a little over $14 trillion in debt, and our economy is over $15 trillion. We were under 100% debt to GDP ratio. What the senator from Vermont is proposing is basically duplicating, without any reforms that I know of, those economic impact payments from the CARES Act, another $275 billion for a total of $550 billion, a $500 billion, sent out again to 115 million households, when right now this is tragedy, every job loss is a tragedy, but we have 9 million jobs less than we had when we had a record level of employment before the recession. 9 million jobs lost, 115 million households. That's 12.6 times the number of jobs that have been lost. I think the question needs to be, if we're going to do this again, is there any sense, any information in terms of how the $275 billion was spent? Well, we have an answer from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. They do a monthly internet-based survey called the Survey of Consumer Expectations. They did 2 special surveys, one in June, one in August. The June survey took a look at how those households spent their $2,400 checks. Here's the results. 18% of those checks were spent on essential consumption, essential. 8% was on non-essential, the fun stuff, I guess. 3% donations. Americans are still generous. For a total of 29% spent on consumption. The marginal propensity to consume was 29%. The remainder, 71%, half of it was put to savings, spent on increasing savings. The other half was paying off debt. They also studied how the unemployment plus-up was spent. Pretty similar results. 24% of those dollars went for essential consumer goods. 4% non-essential, 1% donations, for, again, a total of 29% was consumed. 71% was either saved or used debt reduction. They did another special survey in August, asking those same 1,300 households that they survey, how would you spend a $1,500 check? Not $2,400, $1,500. The response was 14% would be spent on essential items, 7% on non-essential, 3% on donations. For only 24% of a new check would actually be spent on consumption. 76% would either be saved or pay off debt. That's not very good economic stimulus. And again, the numbers are, without any reforms, without trying to target the dollars to people who really need it. I would want to do that. I would like to work with anybody to try and get that relief flowing as quickly as possible to the individuals that need it. And I'm sure the need is still great. It's greater than 9 million. I understand that. But let's look at some figures. I do want to point out a past stimulus in terms of its effectiveness. In 2009, we had the Great Recession. Let me quote some employment figures from that. In January 2008, we had 146 million Americans employed. Remember, right, today we have 149 million. Our record was 159 million, about 146 before the Great Recession. By December 2009, that had dropped, hit the low point of 138 million people working. 8 million people lost their jobs. In January 2009, President Obama was inaugurated, had total control of government, a filibuster-proof Senate, control of the House. He could pass anything he wanted, and they did. They passed the $787 billion American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. They did that in February 2009. At that point, there were 141.6 million Americans working. 141.6 million Americans, and the unemployment rate was 8.3%. Again, throughout 2009, that stimulus didn't work too good because employment fell to 138 million Americans. It took 3 years till January 2012, because of overregulation and overtaxation, to return to February 2009 levels of 141.6 million Americans working. 3 years. That's what we call a slow, non-existent recovery. Oh, a quick aside. Senator Sanders is, the senator from Vermont is talking about we need the $600 plus up for the unemployed because of the suffering. President Obama, with Speaker Pelosi, and Majority Leader Reid with filibuster-proof Senate, they provided a $25 per week plus up to state unemployment when they had total control. Now they're demanding $600. I know that's not part of what the senator from Vermont is asking for in terms of a unanimous consent request. I thought it's just somewhat noteworthy. So again, Madam President, I'm not heartless. I want to help people. I voted to help people. I voted for the $2.2 trillion CARES Act, but I also am concerned about our children's future and the fact that we are mortgaging it. We do not have an unlimited checking account. We have to be concerned about these things. So my complaint about the Senator from Vermont's bill, and quite honestly, the bipartisan effort, we have $600 billion unspent, unobligated. Let's work long and hard. Let's look at economic data. Let's target it properly. Let's not just shotgun it out to the economy again, wasting tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars. Let's focus on that. Let's pretend it's like real money, like it's our money, and spend it well. We don't need to mortgage our children's future by another $300 or $400 billion. We don't need to do that. We can alleviate suffering. We can help our fellow Americans. We could have done it in September, but the good senator from Vermont and all of his colleagues on the Democrat side simply won't take yes for an answer, and my guess is they're taking that same stance today. So, Madam President, I object.
Objection is heard. Senator from Vermont.
Senator from Wisconsin talks about Democrats not taking yes for an answer. So let me tell you what we did not take for an answer. We did not take for an answer the Republican bill which did not have a nickel for unemployment benefits. We did not take yes for an answer for a bill that did not have a nickel for direct payments. Senator from Wisconsin talks about the deficit. Yet the senator from Wisconsin voted for over $1 trillion in tax breaks for billionaires and large profitable corporations. That's okay. Senator from Wisconsin voted for a bloated military budget, $740 billion. That's okay. Senator from Wisconsin supports hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars in corporate welfare. A senator from Wisconsin threw out some numbers. Let me throw out some other numbers. Half of the people in this country are living paycheck to paycheck. Millions of workers are trying to survive on starvation wages of 10 or 12 bucks an hour. 90 million people are uninsured or underinsured, can't afford to go to a doctor. 19 million families spending half of their limited incomes on housing. Madam President, today we have the most severe hunger crisis in America that we have had in decades. Children in this country are going hungry, while 500,000 people are homeless, and many millions more fear eviction. Today, as a result of the pandemic, not only do we have the worst health care crisis in 100 years, but the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. So, Madam President, I say to my colleague from Wisconsin, I will not support proposals that do not provide a nickel in unemployment benefits, not a nickel in direct relief to tens of millions of low-income and middle-income families. So, Madam President, I would hope very much that this Congress appreciates the pain that is out there, and that instead of worrying about tax breaks for billionaires or corporate welfare, let's pay attention to the needs of working families, and let us pass legislation which includes $1,200 direct payment to working-class families, as we did in the CARES Act, $500 to their kids, and certainly not taking a nickel away from unemployment and the other important provisions that are currently being negotiated. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President.
Senator from Ohio.
Madam President, to my colleague from Vermont, my understanding is in a room somewhere near here, right now those negotiations are ongoing, and there certainly better be unemployment insurance. That was in our bipartisan framework that I worked with the presiding officer on, and there certainly better be not just an extension of the existing federal assistance for self-employed workers and gig economy workers, and for those who are now benefiting from the federal extension, the 13-week extension, but also additional funding. And my understanding is direct payments are also in the mix. So I just wish they'd get their work done. You know, it's been 9 months since the CARES Act was done. And I just hope we can figure out a way to get through the hurdles that remain. I've spent much of the day, as my colleagues, I'm sure, talking to colleagues trying to figure out how do you fix the last couple of issues that are apparently out there. But my hope is that even if it's not a perfect bill for me, and it won't be, I know it won't be. You know, we spent 3 or 4 weeks working on legislation that's bipartisan, that isn't what any of us would have crafted individually, but it provides that needed help right now. And we need it, both for the economic crisis that has been caused by this virus, but also the healthcare crisis, which unfortunately is getting worse.